They came up the hill with lanterns, a dozen of them, maybe more, swaying in the black, climbing through snow that swallowed them to the knee. Hungry faces, frightened faces, faces she had once called neighbors, and the young woman stood alone on her porch to meet them. No rifle in her hands, no one at her side, just the cold biting through her father's old coat, and the steady glow of a fire behind her that the whole valley had come to take. They had laughed at her once. All summer long, they had watched the smoke rise from her chimney and called her a fool, a girl lost in her grief, a girl wasting good meat on a winter that would never be that hard. Now their children were starving, and the only food left in all that frozen world hung from her rafters. The lantern stopped at the foot of her yard, and for one long breath, in the killing dark, nobody moved. The smoke rose from the hill every morning, and the town below could not stop talking about it. A thin blue ribbon climbing into the pale autumn sky, steady, patient, endless. It came from a small cabin of peeled logs set against a wall of dark timber, and everyone in the valley knew who lived there now. The Crane girl, Della, 19 years old, and already alone in the world. They watched that smoke the way people watch a thing they don't understand, with folded arms, with shaking heads, with that particular kind of pity that hardens over time into something colder. Because the smoke meant she was still at it, still drying meat, still hanging long red strips on lines between the cabin and the shed, where laundry should have hung instead. All summer she had done this. While the rest of the valley tended gardens and gossiped on porches, the girl on the hill butchered and salted and smoked, as if she were feeding an army no one could see. Grief, the women said softly over their fences. Lost her wits, the men said less softly at the store. They had a name for her now. They said it kindly, which somehow made it worse. The fool on the hill. She had not always been a fool to them. Once, she had simply been Asa Crane's quiet daughter, the one who could ride and shoot and skin a deer faster than most grown men, the one who rarely spoke unless she had something worth saying. Her father had been a man of few words and steady hands. He had built that cabin with those hands. He had taught her everything he knew beside the low orange light of the fire. And then, one cold spring, a fever took him in the space of a single week. And then it was only her, the girl, and the smoke, and the long warm days that everyone else believed would last forever. She did not believe that, not for a moment, but she did not argue. She never argued. She simply kept working. What the town did not know, what they could not have guessed, watching that thin blue ribbon climb the sky, was that her father had left her something far more valuable than the land beneath her feet, more reliable than money, more precious than any deed in any drawer. He had left her away to turn the cruelest winter into the difference between living and dying. And she was the only soul in that whole valley who knew it. The visit came on a still afternoon, when the light lay gold across the meadow grass. Two men came up the road, one in a dark coat, broad and unhurried, the other thin and pale, with a soft voice and softer hands. The first was Harlan Pike, who owned the general store and held half the deeds in the valley like cards in a tight fist. The second was Reverend Ellison, who carried a different kind of authority, but no less binding. They did not come empty-handed. They came with papers. Della met them at the door. She did not invite them in. She stood in the frame with her sleeves rolled and her hands stained dark from the morning's work, and she waited. Pike laid the papers on the rail of the porch, gentle as a man laying flowers on a grave. "Your father," he said, "was a good man." A pause. But not a careful one. He spread the pages with 2 fingers, a column of figures, a line of red ink at the bottom. "There's a debt against this place, Della. A small one, but a debt all the same. And the bank, well, the bank does not forgive." The Reverend stepped in then, his voice low and warm as a hand on the shoulder. "What Mr. Pike means, child, is that this is no place for a young woman alone. There are good families in town, families who would take you in. You could be a help to them." They smiled at her, and in that smile was a whole life laid out for her. A life that was not hers, in a house that was not hers, doing work that someone else chose. They were not asking her a question. They were erasing her. Della looked down at the papers. Then she looked up at the 2 men standing on her father's porch, and her eyes moved, just once, past their shoulders, to the tall, dark stand of timber on the northern edge of her land. She saw the way Pike's gaze flickered there too, quick, hungry, gone in an instant, and in that single flicker, she understood something she would not say out loud for a long time. This was not kindness. This was a man counting trees he did not own, yet. She did not weep, and she did not raise her voice. She only folded her hands across her apron the way her father used to fold his by the fire, and let the silence do the work. "I'm managing fine," she said. 4 words, quiet as falling snow. The Reverend blinked. Pike's jaw tightened just slightly at the corner. They had expected tears. They had expected a frightened girl, grateful for rescue. They had not expected stone. "The first snow comes early in these hills," Pike said at last, gathering his papers. His voice had lost its softness. "A girl alone can change her mind quick when the cold sets in." It was not a warning. It was a deadline. She understood it perfectly. By the first snow, they believed, the loneliness and the hardship would have broken her. She would come down off that hill with her hat in her hands. She would sign, and the Crane place would slide quietly onto Harlan Pike's map of the valley, the way so many places had before it. They climbed back into the wagon and rolled away down the road, leaving the papers unsigned on the rail. Della watched until the dust settled. Then she picked up the pages and carried them inside, and set them on the mantel beside her father's old knife. Not to keep them, to remember them. She did not cry that night. There would be time for crying later, and she knew it. There would be nights this winter when the wind would test every crack in those log walls, and she would have to choose again and again to keep going. But she was not afraid of the choice, because the town had it backwards. Every last one of them. They thought she was a girl drowning in grief, drying meat she could never eat. They thought she had given up. The truth was the exact opposite. She had not been moving on. She had been digging in. That evening, as the gold light faded to gray over the mountains, the woman they called a fool walked out to her smokehouse one last time before dark. She checked the fire, low and slow, just the way he'd shown her. She ran her hand along a row of dark, drying strips, cool and firm to the touch. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard her father's voice, not in sorrow, but in plain, steady truth. Most of what people tell you is just a story, Della. They say the sun always rises, the creek always runs, the relief always comes. They say always, because it makes them feel safe. She pulled the smokehouse door shut against the coming night. Above her, the thin blue ribbon of smoke kept climbing, and down in the valley, the lights came on one by one in the windows of people who were certain, absolutely certain, that they had nothing to fear from the winter ahead. They were waiting for a girl to fail. She was waiting for something else entirely. The credit ran out on a Tuesday. Della would not have marked the day, except that her father had once nailed a small paper calendar by the door. And in all the months since the fever took him, she had never had the heart to take it down. So she knew it was a Tuesday. She walked the long road into town with 2 coins in her pocket and an empty flour sack folded under her arm. She needed salt. That was the heart of it. Salt and a little flour, and a spool of thread to mend the long tear in her father's heavy winter coat. She had the money for it. What she did not have was permission. The morning was bright and hard and cold at the edges, the kind of morning that comes when summer has finally given up its long pretending. Frost lay in the shadows of the fence posts. The grass crunched under her boots where the sun had not yet reached. She walked with her chin level and her eyes forward, the way her father had walked, as if she had every right to the road, as if nothing in the world could touch her. She would need that before the day was done. The store smelled the way it always had. Coffee and leather and dust and dried apples, and underneath it all, the faint, sweet rot of molasses that had soaked into the floorboards over the years. A bell hung over the door. It rang when she came in, light and bright, the way it had rung for her whole life. Harlan Pike stood behind the counter. He did not look up right away. He let her stand there. He let the silence stretch out long and thin between them, the way a man stretches a strip of leather to find the exact place where it will break. Salt, she said at last, and flour, and a spool of thread. Pike set down the ledger he had been reading. He folded his hands on the counter. Slow, easy. The hands of a man who has all the time in the world and knows very well that you do not. Your account's closed, Della. The words came soft, almost gentle, the way you might tell a child that a sick dog had not made it through the night. I have money, she said. She set the 2 coins on the counter. They clicked against the wood, small and bright. Pike looked down at them. He did not move to take them. It isn't about the money, girl. A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. It's the debt against your place. The bank doesn't care to see me extending more to folks who already owe. You understand. It wouldn't be prudent. That word, prudent. It sat there on the counter beside her 2 coins, polished and reasonable and cruel. There were 3 other people in the store, a woman fingering bolts of cloth by the dry goods, 2 men loitering near the iron stove where the first fire of the season ticked and popped, and all 3 of them had gone very, very quiet. All 3 of them were suddenly very busy looking at things that did not need any looking at. Della stood there with her 2 coins on the counter and felt the heat crawl up the back of her neck and into her ears. She could have fought it. She could have asked which bank, exactly, which papers, whose signature. She could have asked Harlan Pike to lay it all out plain, right there in front of God and the dry goods and the two men by the stove. But she did not. Because she had learned something at her father's knee that those three watching people had not. You do not waste your strength rattling a locked door when the man holding the key is the one who locked it. So she did the hardest thing a proud person can do. She picked up her coins, one at a time, unhurried. She folded her empty sack back under her arm, and she turned and walked out into the bright, cold morning with her chin still level and her eyes still forward. The bell rang behind her, light, cheerful, as if nothing at all had happened. It was, she would think later, the cruelest sound she had heard in a long while. That bright little bell, ringing her out of the only store in the valley, as if she were any other customer, on any other day, who had simply forgotten what she came for. She did not come back. Not the next week. Not the week after that. And the town noticed. Of course they noticed. A small valley is a small world, and the absence of a person moves through it like a stone dropped in a still pond. The ripples reach every shore. But here was the strange and terrible thing. They did not see it as cruelty. They saw it as patience. They were not casting her out, they told themselves. They were not hard-hearted people. They were simply waiting. Waiting for the cold and the hunger and the long empty nights to finish the work that gentle words had failed to do. Waiting for the crane girl to come down off her hill and be reasonable at last. The neighbors who had once lifted a hand to her from their passing wagons now found small reasons to look the other way, to study the road ahead, to call to a child, or fuss with a harness, just as her cabin came into view. It was not spite. That was the part that would have hurt the most if she had let it. It was discomfort. Because there is nothing in this world so unsettling as a person who refuses to need you. After you have already decided in your own good heart that they should, Cass Dunmore tried. Once. Cass was a kind woman with too many children and a face that had worn itself into a permanent expression of soft worry. And one gray afternoon, she came up the hill with a loaf of fresh bread wrapped in a clean cloth, because she could not stand the thought of the girl up there alone with nothing. She meant well. She always meant well. That was the whole trouble with Cass Dunmore. The world could be breaking apart at the seams, and she would still be standing in the middle of it, holding out a loaf of bread. She found Della in the side yard. The girl had her arms buried to the elbow in a wooden barrel, her sleeves shoved up past raw red skin, working something down into the brine. Her hair was pulled back hard from her face. Her jaw was set. The cold salt water had cracked the skin across her knuckles, and she did not seem to feel it. "I brought you some bread," Cass said. Della looked up. She wiped her forearm across her brow and left a pale smear of salt above her eye. "That's kind of you," she said, and then she bent back to the barrel. It was not rudeness. Cass would swear to that later, to the other women. It was something harder to name and harder to shake. The girl was somewhere else entirely, somewhere far down inside herself, in a place none of them could follow, doing work whose purpose none of them could see. The visit was short. There was nothing to sit on, and nothing to say, and the wind was coming down cold. off the peaks. The loaf of bread sat on the rough plank table, still wrapped in its clean cloth, when Cass let herself out. She walked back down to town, and she told the other women, gently, kindly, that the Crane girl was not herself. That grief had carried her somewhere dark and far. That there was nothing to be done but wait and pray and hope. She found her way back before the snow closed the road for good. The men were less gentle. "She's burning through her daddy's powder like it's branch water," said a trapper at the store, holding his big chapped hands out to the stove. "Come the deep cold, she'll have herself a cabin full of jerky she can't choke down, and nary a cartridge left to take a rabbit." The men around the stove laughed, but it was an uneasy laugh, the kind that comes out a little too quick and dies a little too fast, the kind that is covering something it does not want to say out loud. Because her competence unsettled them, it always had. She hunted with her father's old rifle, a long, heavy, awkward thing that most grown men in that valley found a chore to carry, let alone to aim. And her shots came home clean and true. She field-dressed what she took with a quiet, practiced economy that wasted almost nothing. She did the work of 3 strong men, alone. And she did not complain, and she did not ask for help. And she did not break. And there is a particular kind of anger that settles over a town when it watches a girl refuse to be rescued. So they let her be. They closed her account, and they turned their eyes from her cabin, and they told themselves, every one of them, that it was mercy. That a hard lesson now would spare her a worse one later. That when the cold finally bit deep enough, she would understand. She would be grateful. She would come down. And all the while, the smoke kept rising from the hill. Quiet. Constant. A question that the whole valley could see, and not one of them yet knew how to ask. What the town could never have guessed was that the closing of her account had given Della something they had never meant to give her. It had given her clarity, because the very morning that Harlan Pike refused her 2 coins, a small, cold thought had begun to turn over in the back of her mind. A thought she could not yet prove. A thought she could not put down. She had been to that store 100 times in her short life, 1,000. She had stood at her father's elbow and watched him pay his accounts, square and honest, season after season. He had owed at planting and paid at harvest, the same as every family in the valley did. That was simply how the world ran out here, where coin was scarce and a man's word filled the gaps. A small debt. That was what Pike had called it. The day they came with the papers. Small. So why had a small debt been enough to slam the door of the only store in the valley shut against her forever? The question would not leave her be. It followed her into the smokehouse and out to the woodpile. It followed her down the cold stone steps into the root cellar and back up into the lamplight. It sat across the table from her at supper, silent, waiting, like a guest who would not leave. And one evening, when the day's work was finally done, and the light had gone soft and gold at the windows, she did the thing she had been circling for 2 long weeks. She took down the box. Her father had kept a tin box on the high shelf above the bed. It was where a careful man keeps the things that matter. A few letters tied with string, receipts folded small, the deed to the land wrapped twice in oilcloth against the damp, and his ledger, a small leather book worn soft as a glove at the corners, where Asa Crane had set down in his slow, square hand every dollar he had ever owed, and every dollar he had ever paid back. Della sat at the table with the lamp turned low. She was not quick with figures. Numbers had never come easy to her the way the woods had. But she was patient, and she had learned long ago that patience is its own kind of cleverness. So she read it slowly, line by line, page by page, following her father's careful hand back through the seasons of his life, and what she found made her go very still. The seed. Pike had named it on the porch like a fact set in stone. A larger sum, Della, for seed that failed in the dry year. He had said it so plainly, so sadly, with such practiced regret, that she had not thought to question it. But there was no seed in her father's book. There was flour. There was salt. There was a length of stovepipe and a box of cartridges, and once a yard of blue cloth that she remembered now had become a dress she had long since outgrown. There were the small, honest debts of a small, honest man. Every one of them marked down. Every one of them paid in full, save the last few. The little ones, from the weeks just before the fever came, and took his voice and then his life. But the seed was not there. Asa Crane had never bought it, had never sown it, had never owed so much as a single cent for it. Della set the book down flat on the table. She did not move for a long, long time. Outside, the wind moved through the timber on the northern ridge, the tall, dark stand of fir, toward which a certain man's eyes had flickered, quick and hungry, the day he stood on her porch with his papers spread out like flowers. And the thing she had not let herself believe finally settled into her chest, slow and cold, like a stone sinking down through still black water to rest at last on the bottom. It was not a debt. It was a door that someone had quietly built into her father's good name after he could no longer speak to deny it. A small, neat lie, written in patient red ink, just large enough to swallow a girl's whole world, her cabin, her land, her timber. Her father's hands had built every log of that place, and a man with soft words and softer hands meant to take it from her with the stroke of a pen. This was not bad luck. This was not the careless ledger of an unlucky man, the way the Reverend had so gently suggested. This was a hand reaching for her land in the dark, and dressing itself up in the clothes of kindness while it reached. She thought of the Reverend's warm and pitying voice. "This is no place for a young woman alone, child." She thought of Pike spreading those papers across her father's porch rail, slow and tender, the way you would lay flowers on a grave. And something in Della Crane hardened that night that would never go soft again. She closed the ledger. She wrapped it back in its oilcloth. She set it on the high shelf beside the deed where it would keep. Evidence now, not just memory, but here is the truth that the old stories leave out when they tell of women who endure. Hardness is not the same thing as strength. A person can be hard as winter iron and still shatter at a single blow if the cold gets deep enough into the metal. And there came a night, deep in the back half of that long, warm autumn, when even Della Crane very nearly broke clean through. It came without warning, the way these things always do. She had worked since well before dawn. She had brought the quarters of a young elk down off the high meadow, her pony blowing hard and lathered, her own shoulders screaming with every step of the descent. She had cut meat until her right hand cramped into a stiff claw that she had to pry open with her left. She had stirred the brine and fed the slow fire and split the wood and checked the racks. Again and again and again. And somewhere in the long blue dusk, with the smell of cold smoke woven into her hair and the deep ache settled into her very bones, the loneliness came for her. Not the small loneliness of a quiet evening by the fire. The big one. The one that has no bottom. The one that comes creeping when a person understands, all at once and all the way through, that there is no one left in the whole wide world who would know, or grieve, or even notice, if she simply sat down in the cold dirt and never got up again. No mother, long gone before she could even remember her face. No father, gone to the fever in the space of a single terrible week. No voice in the next room, no footstep on the porch, no warm hand to reach for in the black hours of the night, only the smoke and the cold creeping down off the high peaks, and a cabin full of dried meat that an entire valley had decided was the work of a girl gone soft in the head. She sank down onto the chopping block beside the woodpile, and for the first time since they had lowered her father into the cold spring ground, she let herself wonder if the whole town had been right about her all along. What if it was all for nothing? What if the relief came the way it always came, the way it had come every single autumn she had been alive? What if the snow held off, soft and late and gentle, the way it nearly always did? What if the long winter passed easy, and the spring came warm and green, and found her standing alone among 400 pounds of meat that no one would buy and no one would eat? The fool on the hill. Proven a fool at the last. What if her father had simply been wrong, and the awful thing, the shameful thing, was that the thought came almost as a comfort, because it would be so much easier to be wrong, so much easier to walk down that hill in the morning, to find Harlan Pike behind his counter and the reverend in his church, to take up the pen and sign the papers and let some other woman's warm kitchen become the whole of her small life, to be taken in, to be a help with the little ones, the way they had promised, to stop fighting so hard, to finally rest. She looked across the dark yard at the smokehouse, at the low orange glow of the fire she had not let die in all these long months, and a tired, terrible thought rose up out of the deepest part of her exhaustion. She could let it go out. Tonight. She could simply not feed it. She could go inside and lie down and let the fire she had tended like a living thing flicker out in the cold dark, and let all of it end. No one would blame her. No one would even be surprised. She sat there on that chopping block for a long, long time, the cold seeping up through the wood and into her, and the choice hung in the still air around her like the last fading note of a song no one would ever hear. And then, slow as the turning of a whole season, a voice came back to her, not loud, not stern, just there. The way the truest things in a life are always just there, waiting, quiet, until at last you grow still enough, and tired enough, and broken enough to finally hear them. Most of what people tell you is just a story. She closed her eyes, and she was a girl again. 14 years old, A worn dime novel open in her lap, the pages soft from too much reading, the lamp guttering low and golden on the table between them, and her father sat across from her, sharpening his knife by the fire, the long, slow rasp of steel on wet stone. He was not even looking up at her when he spoke. "You believe what that book tells you? It's only a story, Pa. Most of what folks tell you is only a story too, Della. The rasp of the stone, the good, clean smell of gun oil and wet wool drying by the heat, the way the firelight moved across his tired, kind, unsentimental face. They'll tell you the sun always rises, the creek always runs, the relief always comes when it's needed." He had tested the blade against his thumb, slow and careful. They say always, because the word makes them feel safe in their beds at night. But the world doesn't have habits, girl. It has tendencies. And the one who mistakes the first for the second is the one who starves. She opened her eyes. The fire still glowed across the yard, low, patient, waiting for her, the way it always waited. And she understood, sitting there on that cold chopping block in the dark with her whole body crying out to quit, that this was the real test. Not the hunger that was surely coming, not the cold, not Harlan Pike and his red ink and his soft, hungry hands. This quiet moment, alone, in the dark, with no living soul to watch her, and every reason in the world to lay it all down. This was the winter her father had truly been raising her for. "You don't do the work for the winter you can see coming," he had told her once, his voice low beneath the singing of the stone. "Any fool prepares for the storm that's already up on the porch, beating at the door. You do it for the winter you can't see. You do it on faith, Della, or you don't do it at all." She wiped her face with the back of one raw, cracked, red hand, and she stood up. Her knees ached, her back ached. Every muscle in her body begged her to turn toward the warm cabin and the soft bed and the easy, easy quiet of giving up. And she walked the other way. She crossed the dark yard to the smokehouse. She unlatched the small door. She knelt by the fire, and she fed it. One length of seasoned alder, then another. She watched the new wood catch and take hold. She watched the smoke begin to curl up again, cool and fragrant, exactly the way he had shown her. Slow, always slow, never near hot enough to cook the meat, only patient enough to cure it. And she did not break. Not that night, not any night that came after it. The work went on, and as the aspens on the high ridges turned all at once to a trembling, shimmering gold, something began to shift in the small, closed world of the valley below, though not one soul in it yet understood what. It began with potatoes. Cass Dunmore came back up the hill, but this time she did not come with a worried face and a loaf of bread held out before her like a peace offering. This time she came pulling a small wooden sled behind her, and on the sled sat a heavy sack of potatoes, and on Cass Dunmore's face was something she had not quite managed to hide before she reached the door. Need. Whit Dunmore was a fine carpenter, a man whose joints fit true and whose word was good. But carpentry does not fill a winter cellar, and the autumn had run lean and hard for the Dunmore family. There were too many small mouths and too few full sacks, and word had moved through the valley, quiet as smoke under a door, that the Crane girl had meat. More meat than one body could ever use in a lifetime of winters. So Cass had come to trade. That was how she said it to herself the whole way up the hill. To trade, not to beg. Because Cass Dunmore was far too proud to beg, and far too frightened for her children not to come. Della saw the need in her face the moment she opened the door, and she did not let it show that she had seen it. She stepped back. She held the door wide. "Come in out of the cold," she said. "There's a fire." And it was inside that small, warm cabin that everything, at last, began to turn. The first thing that struck Cass Dunmore was the warmth. A good fire, well fed, throwing real heat into every corner of the room, the kind of heat the Dunmores had been rationing for weeks now, one stingy log at a time. The second thing was the smell. Not the smell of grief and want that she had braced her whole heart against on the climb up the hill. The smell of fresh bread, cooling on a board by the window. And meat, good meat, turning slow on a spit before the fire, its fat hissing and dripping into the flames. And the third thing made Cass Dunmore stop dead just inside the doorway and forget every careful, proud word she had practiced on the long walk up. The larder. The cabin was small, but every single inch of it had been turned to one purpose. Hams and great sides of bacon hung from the rafters overhead. Long strings of dark jerky swayed gently in the rising heat, knocking softly together like wooden chimes in a breeze. Sacks stood stacked against the far wall, 3 and 4 deep. More flour, Cass realized with a strange cold lurch low in her belly, than Harlan Pike kept on the shelves of his own store down in the valley. She stood there in the doorway, and she looked at all of it, and the story she had carried up that hill, the poor, mad, grief-struck orphan, lost and wasting away alone, fell clean off of her, like a heavy, wet coat dropped in the heat of a fire. This was not madness. This was not a girl who had lost her wits to sorrow. This was foresight, patient, deep, relentless foresight, reaching so far ahead into the dark of a winter no one else could see, that it bordered on something close to prophecy. "Lord above," Cass said softly. Her voice had gone thin. "Child, when did you do all this?" "All summer," Della said. She said it simply, no pride in it, no bitterness, as if it were the plainest and most obvious thing in all the world. Cass set her sack of potatoes down on the floorboards, and all at once, in that crowded, fragrant, firelit room, it looked very small indeed. "I came to trade," she said. The proud words came out small and uncertain now. "Whit, he can fix that leaning shed of yours, come the thaw. He's the best hand with wood in the whole valley. You know that. And there's a cord we could spare, near enough, for a little meat. Just enough for a stew or two, for the young ones." Della looked at the woman standing in her doorway, the worn coat mended at both elbows, the hands chapped raw from cold water and hard work, the 4 small children waiting somewhere down the hill, in a house where the fire was burning low. And she did a thing that surprised them both. She did not simply hand over the meat. She crossed to the larder, and she took down a good heavy side of smoked venison and a full sack of jerky, and she laid them on the rough plank table. A generous amount, far, far more than a sack of potatoes could ever be worth. "Keep your potatoes," Della said. For one terrible moment, Cass Dunmore's face fell. She thought she was being turned away, refused, sent back down the hill empty, to a cold house and 4 hungry children. But I'll take a thing in trade for it, Della went on, before the woman's heart could finish breaking. She met Cass's eyes, steady and level. You keep laying hens, good ones. I'll have 2 of them. Cass blinked. A whole side of venison and a sack of jerky for 2 hens. It was no trade at all. It was a gift, dressed up in the plain, honest clothes of a bargain. And they both knew it, standing there in the firelight. 2 hens were a small thing, easily spared. The meat on that table would feed the whole Dunmore family for weeks of hard winter. But Della had not offered her charity. She had offered her a trade. And in that one small, stubborn distinction lay the whole of what the town did not yet understand about the girl on the hill. Why hens? Cass asked her quietly. You could ask for most anything, child. Why on earth would you want 2 of my hens for all of this? And Della Crane almost smiled. Almost. Eggs, she said, all through the winter, long after the snow's too deep to hunt. She nodded toward the table. That meat there, you eat it once and it's gone. But a thing that keeps on giving, that's worth more than a thing you only eat the one time. Cass Dunmore walked back down the hill that gray afternoon with her sled piled high with good meat, and her sack of potatoes still riding on top of it, unwanted, and a feeling in her chest that she could not, for the life of her, put a name to. She had climbed that hill in the morning, pitying a fool. She came down it in the evening, knowing, all the way down in her bones, that she herself had been the foolish one. That the whole valley had been. All this long, warm season, while they shook their heads and clucked their tongues and waited for a girl to break. That girl had been quietly, patiently, building the only ark in a valley that did not yet know the flood was coming. And that night, for the very first time, the story that moved through the small world of the valley was a different story. Not the tale of a poor mad orphan drowning slow in her grief, but the tale of a young woman of strange, unsettling, almost frightening competence, who sat warm and well-fed and entirely unafraid in a cabin high on a hill, while the rest of them watched their gardens blacken with frost, and their cellars run thin, and waited still for a relief they had simply, always, without ever once thinking to question it, assumed would come. The smoke rose from the hill the next morning, the same as it ever had, but the air it climbed into was sharper now, and it rose a little faster, a little straighter, as if even the fire could feel what was coming down off the peaks, and down in the valley for the first time. A few of them stood at their windows and looked up at it differently, not with pity now, with a small, cold, creeping flicker of something they were not yet willing to name out loud. A question. What does she know up there that we don't? And high above them all, the woman they had called a fool stepped out into the frost-bright morning. She scattered a handful of grain for 2 new hens that scratched and muttered at her feet. And then she crossed to the thin brass thermometer that hung on its nail beside her door, and she bent to read it. The mercury had fallen again in the night, lower than it should have been, far lower than it had any right to be, this early in the season. She straightened slowly, her breath clouded white in the still, sharp air, and she looked up, past the rising smoke, past the trembling gold of the aspens on the ridge, up to the high peaks at the head of the valley, where the first true gray of winter was already gathering and thickening and curling down, weeks and weeks ahead of its proper time. "Most of what people tell you is just a story," her father had said, by the fire long ago. "They say the relief always comes. They say always, because it makes them feel safe." Della Crane pulled her father's mended coat a little tighter around her shoulders, and she turned and she went back to work. The signs came first. They always do, long before the cold ever shows its true face. The world begins to whisper to those who know how to listen. And Della Crane had been taught to listen by a man who trusted nothing he could not read with his own two eyes. She saw the geese go over, not in their proper time, in their lazy, ragged lines, drifting south the way they did every autumn when the air first sharpened. No, they went over weeks early, and they went over fast. Hard, driving wedges of them, high and urgent against the pale sky, their cries thin and far away, as if something behind them was pushing them out of the north. She stood in her yard with her axe forgotten in her hand and watched them go. And she understood what they were telling her. She walked the woods after that, and she read the rest of it. The woolly caterpillars wore bands of black so wide and so dark they were nearly solid. The squirrels were not gathering. They were frantic, their cheeks bulging, their little bodies a blur from tree to tree, their caches already overflowing weeks before the first frost should have driven them to it. And the birches. The birches had let go of their leaves a full 2 weeks too soon, standing now in stark white bones against the darkening hills, as if they too had read the warning and were stripping down for a long, hard siege. The whole forest was preparing. The whole forest knew. And down in the valley, the people knew the very same signs. They saw the geese. They felt the early bite in the morning air. They noticed the squirrels and remarked on the caterpillars over the counter at the store. And after the Sunday service, they knew the signs. They simply did not believe them. Because the people of the valley had learned, over the long, easy years, to place their faith somewhere else entirely. Not in the geese, not in the birches, not in the deep old wisdom of a world that had been turning long before any of them drew breath. They placed their faith in the relief. Every autumn, for as long as anyone could remember, the wagons had come up from the lowlands, heavy with everything a winter at that height demanded: the flour and the salt, the oil for the lamps, the wool to keep the children warm. And so the valley never bothered to lay much by. Why break your back through the warm months hauling and salting and smoking, when the wagons always came? They always came. That was the story the valley told itself, sitting warm by its fires. They held to that word, always, the way a frightened child holds to a hand in the dark. It was the habit the whole town had mistaken for a certainty. And up on her hill, the girl they called a fool watched the geese drive south and saw a different ending to the story entirely. She doubled her wood. She had a great stack of it already, seasoned and split and ready. It would have been more than enough for a normal winter. But Della Crane was no longer preparing for a normal winter. She took the axe to 2 more standing pines and brought them down, and bucked them into rounds, and split the rounds until her palms were raw and weeping, and her shoulders had gone past aching into a strange hot numbness. She banked fresh clay and dried grass into every gap and seam along the north wall of the cabin, sealing it tight against a wind that had not yet come. She checked the root cellar. She checked the smokehouse. She weighed the last of the meat on her father's old scale and marked it in her little book. And the final number sat there on the page, quiet and enormous, near 400 pounds. A winter's worth of food, not for one girl, for a dozen families. And still she worked, because the geese had told her something, and the birches had told her something, and her father had told her, long ago, by the fire, "You do it for the winter you can't see." The first snow came in the night. It came without mercy and without warning, weeks before the oldest soul in the valley had ever known snow to come. It was no gentle dusting, no soft white blessing on the morning fields. It came down thick and wet and heavy, falling out of a low bruised sky that had rolled in after dark, and it fell and did not stop. By the time the gray light crept up over the eastern ridge, the whole valley lay buried under more than a foot of it. The fences gone, the road gone, the hard edges of the world all smoothed away into soft white silence. And the pass. The high pass, the only wagon road out of the valley and the only road in. The pass lay choked and sealed and impassable beneath a great drowning weight of snow. The valley woke to it and frowned, but it did not yet fear. A foot of early snow. An inconvenience, surely. A nuisance. It would melt off in a day or two of sun, the way early snow always did. And even if it lingered, why, the wagons were due any day now. The relief was coming up from the lowlands, even as they shoveled their porches and grumbled over their coffee. The wagons always came. The valley pulled its collar up and went back to waiting. 3 days the snow held the world still. And on the third day, a lone figure came struggling down out of the high country. A trapper, half frozen, his beard caked white with ice, stumbling along on a pair of crude snowshoes. He came down into the valley like a man bringing news from the edge of the world. And the news he brought changed everything. It was not only the snow, he told them, gathered close around the stove in Pike's store, his hands shaking too hard to hold the cup of coffee they pressed on him. It was the pass, somewhere up in the high country, where the road crossed the deep gorge. The old crossing had simply given way in the storm and gone down into the dark. The road out was severed, not blocked, not buried, broken. There would be no wagons creaking up the road from the lowlands, not this week, not this month, not until a crew could be brought all the long way up to set the crossing right again. And no crew on earth would attempt that climb until the spring thaw opened the high country once more. The relief was not coming. The relief that always came was not coming at all. The news moved through the valley like a cold wind through an open door, and by the time it had reached every house and every hearth and every frightened face, it found its way at last up the long white hill to the cabin where the smoke still rose. It came to Della in the plainest way, a neighbor's boy, sent up the road on snowshoes, too breathless and too frightened to come all the way to the door. He stopped at the buried fence line and cupped his hands and shouted the news across the white stillness, his voice cracking on it. And then he turned and fled back down toward the worried yellow lights of town, as if he could not bear to be near her when she heard it. But for Della Crane, the news was no shock at all. It was not a blow. It was not a horror. It was not the bottom dropping out of the world. It was a confirmation. It was the ringing of a bell she had been listening for. All through that long and lonely summer of labor and judgment and salt and smoke, she did not weep and she did not tremble. She only stood in her doorway long after the boy had gone and let the news settle into her, the way snow settles onto a roof already braced and built to hold it. A deep and quiet clarity came over her instead, cold and clean and still, like the snow itself. That night, she sat in her father's chair by the fire, with the storm picking up again outside and clawing at the walls, and she did a strange and quiet thing. She took down her father's old book. Not to read the words of it, she opened it instead to the place where he had always kept a small brass thermometer pressed flat between the pages, the way another man might press a flower. She carried it outside into the dark and the cold, and she hung it on the nail by her door. And at the deep, dead middle of the night, she rose and put on her coat and went out to read it. The mercury stood far down in the glass, far, far down, lower than the valley below had ever felt this early. A cold with teeth in it. A cold that meant business. She pressed her bare palm flat against the log wall of her cabin and felt the great deep cold of the whole wide world pressing back against it from the other side. And she felt, behind her, the warmth of her own good fire pushing the cold away and holding the line. Inside, the cabin was warm, snug, alive. She went back in, and she stood a long while in the soft lamplight, looking at her pantry, at the neat stacked sacks, at the rows of dark jerky hanging from the rafters like wooden chimes gone still, at the hams and the sides of bacon and the heavy canvas sacks of pemmican, that dense and life-sustaining stuff her father had taught her hands to make. And looking at it all, she felt no triumph. That was the strange thing. She had been proven right against a whole valley that had laughed at her, and there was no triumph in it at all. There was only a deep and solemn sense of rightness, the quiet, heavy feeling of a thing done well, that needed doing, the faith she had carried all summer, the stubborn, lonely, aching faith in a dead man's words, had finally hardened into something else, into knowledge. She was not a fool. She had never been a fool. She was a survivor. And she understood now, perhaps for the very first time and all the way through, the true weight of the world her father had tried to teach her to see, a world of tendencies, not habits, a world that did not bend itself to what frightened people needed to believe. Down in the valley, in those first strange days of being sealed off from the world, a fragile kind of cheer held on. Every family had something. A garden cellar with potatoes and squash put by, a few cords of wood, a side of bacon, a sack or two of flour, and Harlan Pike, who held half the deeds in the valley and now found himself holding something far heavier, the eyes of every frightened soul in it, stepped forward to take charge. He announced a system. Rationing, he called it, standing on the porch of his store with his thumbs in his vest. A fair sharing of the stores he kept on his shelves. Flour and salt and coffee, doled out in careful measures, just enough to keep the fear from turning to panic. He spoke of it as leadership, as Christian duty, as the natural order of things, with himself at the steady center of it. And the valley, frightened and grateful for any hand that seemed to know what it was doing, let him. For a little while, it almost worked. But the snow did not melt. The sun did not come. Day after gray day, the snow kept falling, soft and patient and merciless, burying the fences and the gardens and the woodpiles, turning the whole valley into a single vast white silence. And as the white deepened, so did something else. The rations on Pike's shelves grew thinner. The careful measures grew smaller. The line of frightened faces at his door grew longer and quieter and colder around the eyes. And the talk turned. The way it always turns when fear has nowhere else to go. It turned to the girl on the hill, the fool. The one who had wasted a whole warm summer drying meat she could never eat. Except now, when they spoke of her, the word fool came out strange and uncertain in their mouths. Because the smoke still rose from her chimney, steady and warm, while their own fires burned low. Because Cass Dunmore had come back down that hill with a sled piled high, and had told them all what she had seen up there. And a new thought had begun to move through the cold houses of the valley. She has food. She has food enough for all of us. And here is the cruel and human truth of it. That thought did not make them grateful. It made them angry. Because it is a hard thing for a proud people to swallow that the one soul who saw the truth, the one they had mocked and cut off and turned away from, was the very one who now sat warm and fed and safe above them all. The reckoning came up the hill on foot, not in a wagon. The road was gone. They came on snowshoes, two dark figures laboring up through the deep white toward the cabin and its rising smoke. Harlan Pike. And behind him, the Reverend Ellison, his soft hands tucked into his sleeves, his soft face pinched red with cold. They did not find a girl frozen and desperate and broken, as Pike had so confidently expected to find. They found Della Crane in her yard, splitting wood with a steady, powerful, unhurried rhythm. The pile beside her tall and neat, her breath clouding in the cold. Her cheeks flushed not with fever, but with good, honest work and good, honest warmth. She did not stop swinging when she saw them coming. She let them labor the last stretch up through the snow and stand there catching their breath before she set the axe down at last and turned to face them. "Mr. Pike," she said, "Reverend." They did not wait for an invitation. They followed her into the cabin, stamping the snow from their feet, and their eyes went at once to the same scene that had stopped Cass Dunmore cold in the doorway: the warmth, the bread, the meat on the spit, and above it all, hanging from the rafters and stacked against the walls, the plain, impossible abundance of it. And Della watched Harlan Pike's face as he took it in. She watched the careful mask of concern slip, just for a moment, and something else show through underneath. Not relief that she had survived. Hunger and calculation, and a cold dawning understanding that the girl he had meant to break had not broken at all. That she had, in fact, built a fortress of plenty right under his very nose, while he was busy laughing at her. "Della," he began, and his voice had lost every trace of the soft sympathy he had carried up the hill the first time. "The town is in a hard way. You can see that. Our stores are running thin. In a time like this, folks have got to pull together. Pool what they have for the common good." "I have what I need," Della said. She crossed to the fire and stirred it. calm as still water. That is not what I'm speaking of, Pike said, and the edge came into his voice now, cold beneath the words. You've got a surplus here. Far more than one girl could eat in 3 winters. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for your stores, to be shared out among the families that need them. And he named a number in credit, at his store, a fraction, barely a shadow, of what that meat was truly worth now, with the past gone and the relief not coming. The same man who had refused her 2 honest coins for a sack of salt now stood in her cabin and offered her store credit for the food that would keep his whole valley alive. Della looked at him for a long, quiet moment. I'm not selling, she said. Pike's jaw tightened. But I'll trade, she went on, before he could speak. Meat, for work, come the spring, for tools, for livestock, for anything of real value. She met his eyes, steady and level and utterly unafraid. I'll trade with any soul in this valley, fair and square, the same rate for everyone. It was the Reverend who broke in then, his soft face clouding with a holy sort of disapproval. Child, he said gently, this is a time for Christian charity, not for commerce. And Della turned her steady gaze on him. Charity is for the helpless, Reverend, she said, and nobody in this valley is helpless yet. They have hands, they have skills, they have things worth trading. I'll not insult a single one of them by handing out their supper like they were beggars at a back door. Pike's face went dark and red. This was not how it was meant to go. Not at all. She was supposed to be grateful, desperate, dependent. She was supposed to come down off this hill with her hat in her hands and her pride in the dirt. Instead, she stood in her own warm cabin in her father's mended coat, and she dictated terms to him. She was building something. He could feel it, standing there in the heat of her fire. A new way of things, a new order, in which Harlan Pike was no longer the banker, no longer the man who held the deeds and doled out the mercy. You'll sit up here, he said, low and ugly now, and hoard your meat while children go cold and hungry down below. The valley won't forget that, girl. I'll see to it they don't forget. He turned for the door, and at the threshold, with the cold pouring in around him, he stopped and looked back at her one last time, and the soft mask was gone entirely now. What looked out at her was bare and hard and final. Let the winter have you then, he said, and he went out into the snow. The Reverend did not follow him at once. He lingered a moment in the doorway, his soft face troubled, and he looked back at the girl by the fire, at the bread, at the warmth, at the open hand she had offered to a man who deserved none of it. And something moved behind his eyes that he could not yet name, something that would not let him sleep that night, nor for many nights to come. Then he too went out and pulled the door shut behind him, and Della Crane stood alone in the warmth and the firelight and the good smell of bread. She felt no triumph. She felt no anger. She simply endured their judgment, the way she had endured the long heat of the summer and the breaking labor of the autumn, letting it pass through her and out the door with them, into the cold where it belonged. Because they had shown themselves now, plain and clear. The threat was no longer dressed up in the soft clothes of concern and charity. It was bare. It was cold. It was out in the open at last. She went to the window and watched the two dark figures labor back down the white hill toward the valley, growing smaller and smaller against all that endless, silent snow. And outside, the thermometer her father had pressed between the pages of his book fell another notch in the glass. The wind began to rise off the high peaks, and the great cold, the true cold, the killing cold that the geese had fled from weeks ago, came rolling down at last into the valley. She fed the fire, she drew her father's coat around her, and she waited for the worst of it to come. The great cold came down off the high peaks, and it did not leave. It settled over the valley like a heavy hand pressing the whole world flat. The snow stopped falling at last, but that was no kindness. The clear skies that came behind it brought a cold so deep and so still that the very air seemed to ache with it. Smoke rose straight up from every chimney now, thin, desperate, in lines that did not bend. And down in the valley, the long, hard truth of it began to show itself. There is a kind of suffering that comes quiet. It does not shout. It does not break down the door. It comes in small ways, in the cold corners of the cold houses, and it does its terrible work in silence. The blacksmith, a strong man with strong hands, found out too late that half his woodpile was green. It hissed and smoked and gave back almost no heat at all. He moved his whole family into a single room, and they huddled there together beneath every blanket they owned, watching their own breath cloud white in the air above the bed. A family down the road lost their milk cow in the night, their most precious thing. It froze where it stood, in a barn that had never once been built to hold out a winter like this one. And an old trapper, who had lived alone at the edge of the timber for longer than anyone could rightly remember, simply stopped answering his door. When at last they broke it in, they found that he had fallen and could not rise, and could not crawl the few feet to his own woodpile. The cold had crept in through the open seams of his cabin and taken him quiet in his sleep. He had not starved. He had simply made one small mistake in a winter that forgave nothing at all. And his death moved through the valley like a cold finger laid flat against every spine, because it showed them all, plain as morning, how thin the line had grown. How little stood now between a living, breathing family and a silent house with no smoke rising from its chimney. In town, the rationing had failed. Pike's shelves stood near bare. The last sharing of flour had been a grim and silent thing, each family receiving a few poor handfuls in a cupped cloth, walking home through the snow without once meeting another's eyes. The fragile cheer of those first sealed-off days was long gone now. In its place had come something colder. Fights flared up, sudden and ugly, over rumors of one family hoarding more than its fair share. The old bonds of neighborliness, the small daily kindnesses that had carried the valley gently through every easy winter, began to stretch thin, and to fray, and in places, to snap clean through. Fear does that to people. Fear is a fire of its own kind, and a hungry, frightened people will burn down the very thing that keeps them warm, if no one stands up to show them another way. And all the while, the smoke rose steady and patient from the hill. Up in her cabin, Della Crane did not merely survive that cold. She lived. Her days ran to a calm, unvarying rhythm. She rose in the dark and fed her 2 hens, and gathered their small warm eggs out of the straw. She stoked the fire she had never once allowed to die. She ate well, eggs in the morning, a thick stew of dried meat and root vegetables come the evening. Dark bread she baked with her own 2 hands from her own deep stores. The cabin was a small, bright bubble of warmth and life, set down in the very middle of a vast and frozen silence. But she was not at peace, not entirely, because from her doorway she could see the smoke down in the valley growing thinner by the day, and she knew in her bones exactly what thinning smoke meant. The knock came late one night, in the deepest, blackest, coldest part of it. A faint, desperate tapping, nearly lost beneath the long, low moan of the wind as it probed the cabin walls for any weakness, any crack, any way in. Della rose at once and opened the door, and Whit Dunmore all but fell across the threshold, half carrying his wife Cass, the 2 of them caked white with driven snow and shaking so hard they could scarcely stand. And there, in Cass's arms, wrapped in a thin and frozen blanket, was their youngest, a small boy, his face gone pale as the snow itself, his breath coming fast and shallow and wrong. They had walked the whole long mile up from town, through the deep snow and the killing dark, because they had nowhere else in all the world to go. Their wood was gone. Their food was gone. And the boy had taken a fever that would not break, and they had climbed that hill in the dead of night as one last desperate act, because the only place they knew of, with a fire still burning bright, was the cabin of the very girl the whole valley had cast out. Della did not hesitate, not for a single heartbeat. She took the child from his mother's frozen arms and carried him to her own bed and buried him deep in quilts. She pulled the shivering parents to the fire and pressed them down into chairs beside it. She moved through all of it with a calm and certain economy. She set smooth stones to warm at the edge of the hearth and wrapped them in cloth and packed them close around the small burning body of the boy. She ladled hot broth from the pot that always sat ready on her stove and made the parents drink it down, paying no mind to their chattering apologies, their broken thanks, their shame. For that first long hour, she was nothing in the world but a pair of steady hands moving in the lamplight, and slowly, slowly, the boy's breathing began to ease. The terrible pale tightness left his small face, and he sank down from the frightening edge of something into a real and ordinary sleep. His parents, thawed and fed at last, began to weep with the plain animal relief of it. It was Whit who tried to speak of payment. He was a proud man, a good craftsman, and the shame of it was written plain across his exhausted face. "We've nothing left to give you, Della," he said, his voice thick and low. "Nothing at all, but I'm a fair carpenter. Best in the valley, folks have said. I'll work for you. A year, 2, whatever you name. Whatever it takes to make it square between us." Della looked at him for a moment, then at Cass, her tear-streaked face pressed close to her sleeping boy. And she did a thing that neither of them expected. She rose and went to her larder and brought back a good heavy side of smoked venison and a full sack of jerky, near 20 pounds of meat, and she set it down on the rough plank table in front of them. "Your boy needs you strong, Whit," she said. "Eating tonight matters a good deal more than any promise come spring." Cass reached for the meat and then stopped, her thin hand trembling in the air above it, her eyes filling all over again. "We can't," she whispered. "We can't just take this. We've nothing to give for it. Nothing." "You won't just take it," Della said, and she sat down at the table across from them, and the firelight moved soft and warm across her young, weathered, certain face. "My father taught me a thing once," she said quietly. "He said a handout makes a man poor twice, once in the pocket and once in the spirit. And I'll not do that to you. Not to good people." She nodded toward the meat on the table. "So this is no gift. I'll trade you fair for it, but not for your labor, and not for your tools, and not for one single thing left in that cold house down the hill." Whit looked at her, lost. "Then what is there, Della? What do we have left that you'd want?" "What you know," she said. "Or better, for the letting me teach you what I know." And for the next hour, there in the warm lamplight, with their boy sleeping safe and their bellies finally full, she did not simply feed the Dunmores. She gave them the thing itself. She told them of tendencies and of habits, and the great difference between the two that the whole valley had clean forgotten. She told them how the world whispers its warnings to anyone who learns how to listen for them, in the early driving flight of the geese, in the bared white bones of the birches, in the dark wide bands on a woolly caterpillar's back. She told them how to build a proper smokehouse, how to cut the meat thin and against the grain, which wood gave a clean and cooling smoke, and which left a bitter taste behind in everything it touched. How to reckon not the food a family needs for one easy winter, but for the winter that comes hard and early when there is no relief at all on the road. "Next summer," she told them, leaning forward, her eyes bright in the low firelight, "you'll not need to climb this hill to me. You'll have your own smoke rising from your own roof, your own stores laid by deep, and you'll never again have to walk through the snow at midnight praying somebody else's fire is still lit." She was not handing them a single meal. She was planting a seed. And Whit Dunmore, who had come up that hill a desperate and broken man, walked back down it before the dawn, carrying 20 pounds of meat in his arms. And something far heavier and far more precious carried close in his chest. Not charity, knowledge, in the quiet dignity folded up inside of it. What happened next moved through the valley faster than any thaw could ever have. The Dunmores did not tell it as a tale of charity. They were far too proud and far too changed for that. They told it instead as the tale of a fair and honest trade, of a girl who had not looked down on them in their very worst hour, but had treated them as people who still had something left to give. And Whit Dunmore, a man the whole valley respected for his honest hands and his honest word, became her loudest voice. He told anyone who would stand still to listen, by every cold hearth in the valley. She isn't hoarding up there. She's teaching. There's a world of difference between the two, and we'd all of us do well to climb that hill and learn it. So they came. At first they came shame-faced and slow, half expecting scorn. They had laughed at her, after all. They had turned their wagons away from her cabin. They had stood and studied their own boots, while Harlan Pike shut his store against her face. But they found no scorn waiting for them in that warm cabin on the hill. They found a girl who treated every last one of them exactly the same. To the blacksmith, with all his green and useless wood, she traded good meat for the promise of new iron hinges and a fresh-forged plowshare, come the spring. To the family who had lost their cow, she traded for their seed potatoes, a rare and hardy kind whose worth she knew far better than they did. With every soul who climbed her hill, she struck a fair bargain. And with every fair bargain, she passed along a little more of the knowing. And it was among them that the small girl came. Her name was Lottie, no more than 8 or 9 years old, sent up the hill on a borrowed pair of snowshoes far too big for her, sent because her family was too proud to come themselves and too desperate not to send someone. She arrived blue-lipped and silent, holding out a chipped clay jar of honey in 2 mittened hands. The last sweet thing in her family's house, offered up in trade. Della knelt down to the child's level, and instead of simply weighing out the meat and sending her back down into the cold, she sat the girl by the fire. She warmed her small hands between her own, and she began, gently, to teach her. She showed Lottie a woolly caterpillar she kept in a little box on the windowsill and the wide black band on its back, and what it had been trying to tell the whole valley all along. She showed her how to tell alder from pine by the bark alone, how a goose flies when it flies in fear, how to read the bands of frost on a window pane the way other folk read words in a book. And the small girl listened with wide and solemn eyes and forgot, for that hour, to be afraid. "Why are you telling me all this?" Lottie asked at last, in the small, clear voice of a child. "I'm only little." And Della smiled, a real smile this time, all the way through. "Because little folks grow up," she said, "and someday, a long time from now, there'll be another hard winter that nobody believes is coming. And on that day, somebody's going to need to remember." She tucked a strip of jerky into the girl's pocket beside the trade. "It might as well be you." So Della Crane, without ever once asking for it, without ever once meaning to, became the still and beating heart of the valley's long survival. Not its banker, not its preacher, not the man on the porch with his thumbs hooked in his vest, just a girl with a full larder and an open hand and a fierce, stubborn belief that no soul on earth should ever have to trade away their pride for their supper. And the smoke that rose from her hill no longer looked, to anyone in that valley, like the smoke of a fool. It looked like the only warm and certain thing left in all that frozen white world. It looked like hope. But hope in a frightened place is a dangerous thing to hold, because there was one man down in that valley who watched it all rise toward her and felt his whole small kingdom crumbling out from under his feet. Harlan Pike watched his rationing fail. He watched his authority drain away like meltwater into snow. He watched the frightened, grateful eyes of the whole valley turn away from him on his porch and lift, instead, toward the steady smoke on the hill. And a man like that does not lose his crown quietly. It came on the worst night of all. The cold had reached its cruelest depth, the wind shrieking down off the peaks, when Della heard it. Not a knock this time. Voices, many of them, and the crunch and stamp of many feet, laboring up the hill through the snow. She went to the window, and she saw the lanterns, a ragged line of them, swaying and bobbing in the dark, climbing toward her cabin. A dozen figures, maybe more, and at the front of them, hanging back just a little, just enough, a broad, familiar shape in a dark coat. Pike had not come himself to take her stores. He had done something colder. He had gone from cold house to cold house to frightened fathers and weeping mothers, and he had whispered to them. He had told them there was a girl up on the hill hoarding food enough for them all, while their own children went hungry. He had not raised his own hand. He had lit the fire in others and sent it up the hill to do his burning for him. Della stepped out onto her porch, alone, the cold seizing her at once. The crowd stopped at the foot of her yard, lanterns trembling, faces she knew half hidden in the dark. Good people, desperate people, people with hunger gnawing at them and a man's poison whispering in their ears. "We don't want trouble, Della," one of them called, his voice shaking. "But our young ones are hungry, and you've got plenty. It isn't right. It isn't Christian." She did not step back, and she did not reach for her father's rifle, though it stood just inside the door, within easy reach of her hand. She simply stood there in the lantern light, small and steady, and let them look at her. And it was then that another figure broke from the dark at the edge of the crowd and turned and put his own body square between Della and the lanterns. Whit Dunmore. "You'll not take one strip of meat off this porch," he said, and his voice did not shake at all. Not one. A murmur ran through the crowd. "She didn't hoard," Whit said, turning to face them, his breath pouring white in the freezing air. "You hear me? She didn't hoard a thing. My boy was dying in my arms, and she took him in, and she fed us, and she sent us home with 20 pounds of meat. And then she taught me how to never need her again. That's what's up on this hill, not a hoarder." He swept his arm out toward the silent cabin behind him. "A teacher, and you'd burn her down to keep from feeling ashamed." The lanterns wavered, and one by one, the faces in the crowd began to change, to soften, to fall, because they knew Whit Dunmore. They knew his honest hands and his honest word, and they knew, in the deepest part of themselves, that what he said was true, that they had let a frightened, bitter man point their hunger like a loaded gun at the one soul who had done nothing but help them. The shame moved through them like the cold, and the lanterns began, one by one, to turn back down the hill. At the very back, the broad shape in the dark coat stood alone a moment longer, watching his fire go out, watching the last of his small kingdom crumble into the snow at his feet. And then Harlan Pike turned too, and went down into the dark, unseen, unfollowed, and utterly alone. Della Crane stood on her porch until the last lantern had gone. She was shaking. From the cold, yes, but from the other thing too. And then she felt a small hand slip into hers, Lottie, who had come back up the hill behind the crowd and slipped through the dark to stand beside her and would not be sent home. Della looked down at the child, and then out at the valley, at the small scattered lights in the windows below, fires that still burned in part, because she had shared what she had, and shared the knowing of how to make more. And the loneliness that had so nearly broken her on that dark chopping block in the back half of the autumn did not come for her any more. She was alone, yes, but she was not lonely, not in that same hollow way ever again, because she understood, at last, standing there with a child's hand in hers, and her breath clouding white in the bitter dark, what her father had truly been preparing her for. All those long evenings by the fire. Not the surviving, the giving. But the winter was not finished with the valley yet. And neither, by a long and bitter way, was Harlan Pike. The thaw did not come all at once. It never does. It came the way mercy most often comes, slow and quiet and almost too late to believe in at all. But before the thaw, there came one last knock upon Della Crane's door. It was still the deepest part of the winter. The cold had not yet broken. It had only bent, just a little. The way a thing bends in the moment right before it finally gives. And the snow was falling again that evening, thick and soft and silent. So thick it seemed the whole gray sky had come loose from its moorings and was sinking down at last to meet the earth. She heard the steps on her porch before the knock ever came. Slow steps, heavy, uncertain. Not the quick, desperate feet of a frightened neighbor with a sick child in her arms. Something else, something that hesitated a long while out there in the dark and the cold, gathering itself, losing its nerve, gathering itself again, before it finally raised a hand to her door. Della crossed the room and opened it. And there, on her porch, stood Harlan Pike. Alone. He looked older than she had ever seen a man look. Smaller somehow, swallowed up inside that broad, dark coat that had once made him seem so solid, so certain, so untouchable. The thumbs that had hooked so proudly into his vest, back when the meadow was still green and the world still bent to his will, now hung empty and useless at his sides. The man who had laughed at her, who had closed his store against her face, who had built a quiet lie into a dead man's ledger and sent a mob of frightened neighbors up her hill with lanterns and hunger in their hearts, stood now on her porch with the snow gathering soft on his bowed shoulders, and he could not lift his eyes from the floorboards. He did not speak of the town this time. He did not speak of the common good. He did not speak of rationing, or of pooling what they had, or of the natural order of things with himself at the steady center of it. All the fine and reasonable words were gone clean out of him, for the first time in his whole life, perhaps. Harlan Pike spoke only of his own. "My daughter's girl," he said, and his voice was a ruin of itself, cracked and small. "The little one. She hasn't had meat in near a month now, and the fever's come on her." He swallowed hard. "She's so small, Della. You've never seen a child so small." He lifted his eyes to her face at last, and there was nothing left in them of the man who had stood on her father's porch, counting the tall, dark timber on the northern ridge. Nothing of the banker. Nothing of the schemer. There was only a grandfather, frightened half to death for a child. He brought his hands out slowly from inside his coat, and in them he held a small bundle, wrapped in a worn and faded square of cloth. He unwrapped it there in the doorway, his cold fingers clumsy and trembling at the knots. Inside was a music box, small, made of brass gone dark with tarnish, worn smooth at every corner from years and years of a loving hand. The kind of thing a man keeps, not for its weight in coin, but because it holds the last warm echo of a voice that has gone silent. "This was my wife's," Pike said, very quietly. "She's been gone 11 winters now." His thumb moved over the worn lid, just once, the slow, helpless way a person touches a thing they cannot bear to set down. It played for her every night of our years together. "It's the last thing of any value left to me in this whole world. He held it out to her in both his shaking hands. "Please," he said, "it's all I have. I know what I've done to you. I know I've no right under heaven to stand here and ask you for a single thing." His voice broke. "But I'm not asking for charity. I'll trade you for it, whatever you judge it's worth. For meat. For my granddaughter's life." And Della Crane stood there in her doorway, in her father's mended coat, and she looked at the man who had once tried to take everything she had in the world. She could have closed the door. No soul in that whole valley would have blamed her for it. Not Whit Dunmore, not Cass, not one of the frightened neighbors who had stood on that very hillside with a lantern in hand, and then turned away in shame when they remembered what kind of girl she truly was. This was the man who had lit that fire and sent it up the hill to burn her. This was the architect of every cold and bitter thing the long autumn and the longer winter had thrown against her. She could have let the winter have him, just exactly as he had once stood in her warm cabin and turned for the door, and wished the winter would have her. But she looked down at the little brass music box, trembling there in his old hands, and she did not see an enemy. She saw a man, caught the same way she had been caught, the same way the whole proud valley had been caught, in the great indifferent machinery of a world that does not bend itself, ever, to what any of us most need to believe. She saw a grandfather with snow in his hair, frightened for a small girl burning with fever, and standing there in the falling dark, she understood at last the final thing, the hardest thing, that her quiet father had ever tried to teach her by the fire, that a strength which cannot also be gentle is not strength at all. It is only one more kind of hardness, one more kind of cold. She reached out, and she took the music box from his hands, and she did not pocket it or weigh it or set it aside. She carried it across her warm room, and she placed it carefully up on the mantel above her fire, right there beside her father's old worn knife. Then she turned and went to her larder and brought back a heavy sack of pemmican and a good smoked ham besides. It was a generous amount, far more in the brutal new arithmetic of that winter than a tarnished brass music box could ever hope to be worth. She placed it gently into his arms. "This is the price," she said, her voice level and quiet, without one trace of triumph in it, and without one trace of malice either. "It's the same price I'd give to any soul who climbed this hill, the same for the Dunmores, the same for the blacksmith, the same for you." She met his eyes. "The price is the same for everyone, Mr. Pike." He stared down at the food gathered in his arms, and then he looked up, slowly, at her face. And whatever he had braced himself to find waiting there, scorn or gloating, or the cold, hard satisfaction of an old debt finally come due, he did not find any of it. He found only a tired, steady, level kindness. And that, more than any harsh word she could ever have spoken, finally broke the man clean through. His proud shoulders shook. He could not get a word out. He gathered the food close against his chest like something precious, and he bowed his gray head, and he murmured something down toward the floorboards that might have been a thank you, and might have been a prayer, and might have been both at once. And then he turned and went down off her porch and out into the falling snow. He did not look back, not once. The threat that had hung over her life since that first still afternoon in the gold of late summer had not merely been beaten. It had been humbled down into something small, down into something human, down into something that Della Crane could almost find it in her heart to pity. The thaw came in earnest not long after that night. It announced itself the way it always does. The steady drip of water from the eaves at first. The deep, rich smell of wet earth rising up through the rotting gray snow. The creek finding its own glad voice again, low and chuckling, where it had run silent and frozen hard for so many long weeks. And as the white world melted slowly back into the brown, and then the tender green, the small world of the valley had been remade just as completely as the land itself. Because the story did not melt away with the snow. The story stayed. It stayed in the telling, by every hearth in the valley, all through that long muddy spring and the green summer that came rolling in behind it. The Dunmores told it. The blacksmith told it over the ring of his hammer. The family who had traded away their seed potatoes told it. A dozen families told it, and then a dozen more after them. Every soul who had climbed that hill in their very worst hour, and come back down it carrying meat in their arms and dignity in their chests, both at the very same time. They did not tell it the way a courtroom tells a thing, with papers and seals and solemn oaths sworn over a book. They told it the way real truth gets told among real people, in the daily commerce of just living, over fences, at the well in the morning, in the small, honest exchanges of folk who have learned the hardest way there is, exactly which among them can be trusted when the cold comes down. And that telling did a thing that no lawyer alive could ever have done. For there came a bright morning when the high roads had opened at last and the whole world had thawed, that Whit Dunmore made the long journey down to the county seat. He did not go alone. He went carrying a paper of his own, and on that paper were set down the marks and the signatures of near every last family in the valley, the careful letters of folk who could write, and the honest crosses of folk who could not. A petition, a testimony, a whole wall of plain, honest names standing shoulder to shoulder. It told of the lie that had been quietly built into a dead and honest man's ledger, after his voice was stilled and he could no longer rise to deny it. It told of what the Crane girl had done all through the long killing winter, when the man who had wronged her held every scrap of power in that valley, and she had held only a full larder and an open hand. And it asked, plain and simple, that the false debt against her land be struck down, for good, forever. The first name on that paper, set down above all the others in a careful, shamed, deliberate hand, belonged to the Reverend Ellison. He had not slept well since the night he stood in her doorway and watched her offer bread to the man who meant to ruin her. And on the first Sunday after the thaw, he had stood before his small congregation and preached a sermon on humility, on the sin of mistaking comfort for righteousness and judgment for mercy. And every soul in that room had understood, without his ever saying so, that he was speaking of himself. He never again raised the word charity in that valley without first thinking of a girl on a hill who had taught him what it truly meant. And there was no one left with the heart to fight the petition. The one man who might once have stood against it no longer had the standing, nor the will, nor the smallest stomach for the fight. And when the paper at last came round to Harlan Pike, he signed it too. He signed it without a single word of protest, and his name, set down there at the very bottom of that long column of honest names, was perhaps the truest and most honorable thing the man had set his hand to in many a long, hard year. The lie was struck from the books. The land was hers, free and clear, and forever beyond the reach of any grasping hand. Every log her father's own hands had raised up out of the timber, every acre of dark fir on the northern ridge that a certain man's eyes had once flickered toward, quick and hungry, in the gold of a long-gone afternoon. She had not won it back with gold. She had won it back the only way that anything is ever truly won, in a way that lasts, with foresight, and with hard work, and with mercy shown to the very man who had shown her none, and with the steady, stubborn, hard-earned trust of the very people who had once stood at their fences and called her a fool. The years went on after that, the way the years always do. And Della Crane never once came down off that hill to live the small, borrowed, second-hand life that two men had laid out for her, so kindly, in the gold of an afternoon long ago. She had found, somewhere down in the dark of that long, hard winter, a sufficiency in her own two hands and her own clear eyes and her own quiet judgment that she was never again, for any man, willing to trade away. There were offers as the years went on. There always are, for a woman of such quiet and unsettling competence. But she had learned on a cold chopping block in the back half of one terrible autumn the great difference between being alone and being lonely, and she had no fear at all of the first. Her life was not a solitary one, though. Far from it, because the valley had learned its lesson in that winter. And the valley did not forget. Each and every autumn after that hard year, the families came together for the great hunt, not in the old, scattered, careless, every man for himself way that had so nearly destroyed them all, but as one, a coordinated thing, planned and shared, and a good share of all that they took was brought up the hill to the great new smokehouse, the fine sturdy one that Whit Dunmore raised with his own honest hands, built true to Della's own careful design, there to be cured slow and stored deep against the lean times, for the good of every soul in the valley. And she taught them. That, in the end, became her true place among them. Not the banker, not the preacher with his soft hands and softer words. The teacher. She taught the men how to read the early, driving flight of the geese. She taught the women how to pound out the dense, dark, life-giving bricks of pemmican that could carry a whole family clear through a winter with no relief anywhere on the road. She taught the children to tell alder from pine by the bark alone, to read the wide black band on a caterpillar's back, to tie a clean and proper butcher's knot. She became the one who remembered, the living book of all the hard-won knowing that had saved them, the place the whole valley turned to, season after season after season, so that the thing which had so very nearly destroyed them once could never quite manage to destroy them again. And the little brass music box stayed exactly where she had set it, there on the mantel, above the fire, beside her father's old worn knife. She never once wound it, never heard the small tune it had played every night. For a woman 11 winters gone, it was not hers to play, after all, but she kept it there, all her long life, not as a trophy, not as the spoils of some war that she had won. She kept it as a reminder that anyone, even the proudest man, even the cruelest, even the one who holds all the deeds and all the power and all the easy certainty in the whole wide world, can be brought low in a single season by a winter he refused to believe was ever coming, and that the only thing worth doing when such a fallen man at last comes and stands trembling at your door is to set for him the very same fair price you would set for anyone. The price is the same for everyone. As for the man himself, Harlan Pike lived out his remaining years far quieter than he had ever lived them before. He kept his store, but he was a changed man behind that counter, slower to judge a soul, slower to close an account in hard times, slower ever after to mistake a long run of easy winters for any kind of promise from a world that makes none. His granddaughter lived. The fever broke with the coming of the spring, and the small girl grew up straight and strong. And it was said, by those who would know, that the old man could never afterward quite bring himself to look up at the steady smoke on the hill, without something soft and ashamed and grateful moving slow across his weathered old face. He had climbed that hill the first time as a man counting trees he meant to steal. He had climbed it the last time as a beggar, with a music box held out in two shaking hands, and he had come down from it, that final time, carrying something he had not even rightly known that he had lost, his own humanity, handed back to him, gently, by the very girl he had once set out to break. The seasons turned, and turned again, and turned again after that. The girl on the hill grew older, the way that all of us must. The dark hair went silver at the temples. The strong, sure hands grew slower, and then stiff. But the smoke still rose from her chimney every single morning, faithful as a heartbeat. And the whole valley below her slept the easier for the simple sight of it. And one warm summer evening, near the very end of a long and quiet and well-lived life, an old woman sat out on her porch in the last of the gold light, and watched a young woman come walking up the hill toward her. She was grown now, tall and strong, and sure of her step. She carried a small child balanced on one hip, and a basket heaped with fresh-picked huckleberries hooked over her other arm. It was Lottie, the small, blue-lipped girl who had once climbed that very hill on a borrowed pair of snowshoes 3 sizes too big for her, holding out a chipped clay jar of honey in 2 trembling, mittened hands. She had never once forgotten. She had grown up reading the geese and the birches and the bands on the caterpillars' backs, exactly as she had been taught beside a fire, on the coldest, darkest night of the worst winter that valley had ever known. And now she came up that hill every season to learn the last of what the old woman still had left to teach, and to bring her own small child along behind her, so that the little one might begin, in time, to learn it too. The old woman and the young one sat together on the porch, side by side, as the long light went soft and gold over the shoulders of the mountains. "You'll have to start teaching her soon," the old woman said, and nodded toward the child drowsing on Lottie's hip. "Little folks grow up a good deal faster than you'd ever think." And Lottie smiled, and she gave the words back, gently, the very same words that had been given to her by that fire, so very long ago. Because someday there'll be another hard winter. one that nobody believes is coming. And somebody is going to need to remember. The old woman closed her eyes in the warm last light of the day, and she thought, not of the cold, and not of the cruelty, and not of the long and lonely, back-breaking labor of that first terrible summer, but of a quiet man sharpening his knife by a fire, telling a stubborn, half-grown girl that the world has only tendencies and never habits. That you do the work not for the winter you can plainly see coming up the road, but for the one you cannot. She had done the work, and here, now, in the soft gold of the evening, on a porch she had earned with her own hands, and a hill that was hers beyond any man's taking, with the knowing she had carried all her life now passing down, gentle and sure, into a third pair of small and waiting hands. She understood, all the way through, that she had done so much more than merely survive. She had built a thing that would outlast her. Not the cabin, not the land, not even the great smokehouse standing sturdy down the slope. The remembering. The valley would forget her name in time. That is the way of valleys and the way of years. The faces would change, and the stories would soften and blur at their edges. And one far day, there would be no living soul left who knew that there had ever been a girl whom a whole town once called a fool. But on some far winter, long after she herself was gone, when the geese flew south too early, and the birches let go of their leaves before their proper time, somebody, somewhere down in that valley, would feel a small cold certainty rise up quiet in their chest. And they would not sit and wait for a relief that was not coming. They would dig in. And they would never once know whose voice it was, whispering down to them through all the long passing years, telling them gently to be ready. That was her legacy, not a monument, not a name carved deep in cold stone, just a quiet, living thread of knowing, passed from hand to hand and fire to fire, down through all the long winters yet to come. The old woman sat on her porch in the last of the fading gold. Somewhere close by, the child laughed, and the smoke rose up from the hill, thin and blue and steady, the way it always had, the way in that valley it always would.